As I've done before, I want to give you guys some context and overall thought each week around, the Gospel of Matthew, and then around just some themes that happen around the concept of the Beatitudes. So let's see if this is going to work. Okay, is that moving for you guys?
Yeah.
So a lot of times when we read the Beatitudes, we have this question: is this really about us versus them? And what how does Jesus pick who gets what? The ones that are meek, the ones that mourn, the ones that who are poor in spirit. Why does one get the kingdom of heaven? One does why inherit the earth? Why does one receive this blessing or that? And it can kind of set up a kind of an us versus them mentality that we're the good ones. We're the ones that are trying to follow the Beatitudes. There are these, of course, all these thoughts and teachings from Jesus, and then there's the others. And of course, the Bible sets up this because humanity does. And that's one of the things that I think is so important about how we read the Bible. This is a story of humanity. It's kind of the story of God and humans, and how humanity expresses and finds itself in the midst of the holy and the imagination of people who, the guy that wrote Psalm 23, we attribute that to King David. How could you imagine something so amazing and beautiful and then write that down? There's a reason why Psalm 23 is so popular, because it's just an amazing thing to think about, that we have this God who at the very end of that psalm is pursuing us for good, not for harm, and all of those. But in the Bible, we do have lots of things that set up enemies and allies, the reality of humanity. But there's a couple of things I want to share with you that bring some real kind of confusion into a lot of that. And the one example I want to use and really focus on as we start is Joshua. Joshua is the leader of the Israelites. Joshua is been told that he's going to go on the promised land. And if you remember the story of Joshua is one of the 12 spies that went to go spy on Canaan. 10 were bad and 2 were good. And what did they see when they spied on Canaan? You remember that song? I don't know if you remember singing that song as a kid. But what they saw were these massive giants, and, it created all this fear in the Israelites' minds. And so when they come into Canaan decades later, and they come into this land where they had been previously before and seen all these giants, and God's going to tell them to go do, or they have this in their imagination, they've been told that they need to go and destroy completely this town called Jericho. Probably one of the most disturbing stories in our scripture. They walk around the city 7 times, they blow horns, and the walls come tumbling down, and the soldiers go in and kill everything in that town. Animals, men, women, children, everybody is gone. The whole thing has been razed down. And it's one of those things where a lot of people, kind of wonder, what's the story all about? And man, if this is the God that we're trying to connect to, I don't want to have anything to do with this God that allows genocide and all of that to go on. But there's this interesting take right before Joshua and the Israelites take Jericho. And this is in Joshua chapter 5. Once when Joshua was by Jericho, again, it's a weird insert. it's kind of a weird placement, and it's a weird intro in. It almost feels like it was put in later, because it doesn't give any context before or after. It's just kind of put in there. It's kind of slide in, and it just says once. When Josh was by Jericho, of course, it was before the walls came down, so we kind of get some kind of a timeline on that. But was it, 2 days before, a week before, a month before? We don't know what all that's about. So once when Joshua was by Jericho, he looked up and he saw a man standing before him with a drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said, "Are you one of us or one of our adversaries?" Which would be the people living in Canaan, the people in Jericho. And this man replied, "Neither. But as a commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped. And he said to him, "What do you command your servant, my Lord?" The commander of the army of the Lord said to Joshua, "Remove the sandals from your feet. It is holy." And so Joshua did, and he ends up worshiping. Now, this word "neither," and in the context of what's about to happen to these people in Jericho, have led scholars and professors and commentators in fits, tied up, wondering why would this person who comes and says, I'm not one of you, and I'm not one of your adversaries. I'm not in this battle. I'm not in this fight. But as a commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. A lot of people, some commentators will say, well, if you put it in context, it's obvious that word "neither" it isn't the right translation, isn't the right word. And some people use the word "truly," which doesn't answer the question. Truly I have come. That doesn't answer the question. And then, of course, there's some commentators who and teachers that will loop this part of Scripture and talk about who the army of God is, and then make the claim that the person that's standing in front of Joshua is actually Jesus, the Son of God, to try to figure out what this means and how this kind of makes sense. But there is a sense, of course, then God says, "I'm going to come and I'm going to help you defeat Jericho." And then after that, of course, gives Joshua all these different instructions, and Jericho falls. And they kill everybody in it and everything in it. But there is this question about who's on what side. And right before one of the biggest battles in the history of the Bible, one of the most kind of the ones that captures everybody's attention. It's interesting how we've made the Battle of Jericho into kind of a kid story. What a insane kid story. No, it's not for kids. But there's this question: whose side is God on? And that's what Joshua's asking him. And he gets this question: well, I'm on neither side. But now I have come, I am here. So there is that question of who is God? Is God for us? Is God for them? We, of course, see that in the whole entire story of Jonah, where Jonah is running away because he gets it. He knows that God's going to forgive the Ninevites, and he hates the Ninevites. So there's a question in there. There's a wondering: is the Bible so clear cut that God's for us and not for other people? Because the Beatitudes kind of sends it that way as well, because certainly there are categories that people should fit into, and if they don't fit into there, is God for them as well? And we're going to break that down a little bit as well. So we're going to do that by looking at the genealogy between Matthew and Luke, and that'll give us a little bit of an insight on who is God for, what side is God on. And it's going to be, I hope it's not too confusing, before we jump into some of I think the fourth and fifth Beatitude. Excuse me. This is where one of the examples when people tell me that the Bible is without error, excuse me, is inerrant. I would like for them to go read the Matthew genealogy and the Luke genealogy. Which one is right? They disagree wildly from one another. Well, if it's without error, tell me which one's the right one. Of course, then we kind of stumble around and that. Matthew's genealogy, if you look at the very beginning of Matthew, starts with Abraham. Everything starts with Father Abraham. Doesn't go any back further than that. Matthew's genealogy starts at the beginning of the gospel. This is how you introduce Jesus to Matthew's audience. The line of Jesus comes through, of course, it comes through Abraham all the way to David. But when you get to David, David has all these sons. And in the Matthew gospel, the line continues through King Solomon. There's a reason why that is happening, and I'll go through that here in a minute. In the genealogy of Matthew, there are three groups of 14, which equals a 42 total of generations from Abraham to Jesus. 2 times 7 is 14. 7 is, of course, the symbol of perfection and covenant. And also the numerical value of David's name. All the Hebrew letters have a number attached to them, and that gives you kind of the numeric value of David. Matthew has an agenda. Matthew is tying Jesus's lineage, his genealogy, straight to Abraham. Of course, not to Moses. And if we've been through the Gospel of Matthew now, I think in this legacy series about 6-8 weeks, and several times there is this pushback between Jesus and the Pharisees, because the Pharisees see themselves going back to Moses, the lawgiver, and Matthew has Jesus connected constantly with Abraham, who came to faith without the law. I may have told this story before, but one of my seminary classes, we were talking about original sin and the law and all those kinds of things that we got broken up in these groups during class. And there's a guy in our class, his name was Abraham. It's a great name. I have a friend of mine who lives down the street named Abraham. And we started talking about salvation, and he was very much into the law. The law is the only thing that saves. You know, Luther Seminary is a wide variety of people that come and study at that. So you're not just getting one view of things and in conversations with people, which I find valuable. But he was talking about the law and that salvation comes from the law, and you can't get away from the law. And I just said, well, Abraham, your namesake, came to faith without the law. Abraham was called straight up. There wasn't a law. There wasn't anything that he was told he had to do. He had a vision. He had a calling, and he left where he was and he went. Which is a very interesting idea that this Matthew then would head west to find God instead of east. This Abraham. And this Abraham in my Luther Seminary class could not believe that was the case. He never heard that before, which kind of blew my mind because his name was Abraham. So we actually opened our Bibles and we walked him through Abraham's story. And the law doesn't come with Abraham. The call comes to Abraham. And that's where Matthew links Jesus all the way back to Abraham. But Matthew's genealogy is going to differ wildly from Luke. And this is how it changes in the Gospel of Luke. The genealogy of the Gospel of Luke starts with God. And it comes as Jesus starts his public ministry. I think it's 3 chapters in, 3 or 4 chapters into Luke's gospel, that's when the genealogy comes. And it starts with God, Adam, and then moves through all of these names. The line of Jesus doesn't come through Solomon in Luke. It comes through another David's son called Nathan. And in the Gospel of Luke's genealogy, of course, 7 is another number that's used. Augustine has it at 77 total generations, not 42. And 77, of course, is a symbol of forgiveness of sin. 717 is amazing, right? It's a perfect, one of the perfect numbers. And then you put another 7 to it, and the symbol of forgiveness of sin there. So you have these different genealogies in Matthew and Luke. And as we talk through, why does this matter in the fact of who's in and who's out? Well, with Luke, you see, and first of all, why do we compare? Because they're contemporaries. They probably wrote their gospels at the same time, within 5 or 10 years of each other. And they both use the Gospel of Mark the Gospel of Mark as reference material. And you can see, but there are different motivations. Matthew continues to point to Christ, and we talked about this a little bit more earlier, and then he spiritualizes the Beatitudes. It's not just poor. Luke has poor. Matthew adds in spirit, and we read through all these Beatitudes, and Matthew spiritualizes them a lot more than Luke does. Matthew starts with Abraham. He starts with the first ones that are set apart, the first ones that were chosen. The line of Jesus was official through Solomon, because Solomon was the spiritual leader of the people. The kings were also the spiritual leaders of the people. And typically what happened in the line of the kings was they started getting out of whack, and a prophet had to come in and tell them to shape up. And it was the king that typically was the apostate that led the people away from God and led them into other gods. So Matthew has obviously a definite spiritual reason why he goes through King Solomon. Nathan never becomes the king. Nathan's family line takes over at some point in time, but Nathan never does. Solomon is the spiritual leader, the one that makes all of that right in Matthew's mind. Luke points to Jesus as the healer. That's the great kind of contribution that Luke has in his gospel. Luke is very, very concerned with remedying the injustice. That's one of the reasons why you see the Beatitudes in Luke aren't spiritualized. They are, if you're poor, you're gonna be remedied. If you're hungry, that's gonna be remedied. If you're part of the injustice, that's gonna be remedied. That is they're quick, they're easy, they're simple. And then of course, then Luke has these woe to yous and all of that. The line is from Nathan. It physicalizes Jesus. It doesn't over spiritualize Jesus. It physicalizes him. It puts him in that kind of that genealogy. And then the line starts all the way back with God. Now, here's the thing that's different in Luke than in Matthew. And that's why when we talk about who's in, who's out, you use that one line from Joshua to think through, well, what does it mean that guy was on neither side? What does it mean that Luke has Jesus' heritage genealogy going all the way back to God? Well, if we read that first part of Genesis, before we get to Genesis 12, where we have the appearance of Abraham, the first 12 chapters of Genesis, really, or 11 chapters of Genesis, are all these stories of humanity trying to figure it out, and they blow it all the time. You've got the Noah story, right? The flood story. You've got the Tower of Babel, and what happens you've got Cain and Abel, right? What happens at the Tower of Babel is that God finally says, you know what? I'm done with this. We're going to blow this whole thing up, and we're going to send everybody, and I'm going to mix up the languages, and these people are never going to be able to get together again, right? They're not going to be able to have one common language. Well, if Jesus' lineage or genealogy in Luke comes straight from God to Adam, then we're including all of those people before Abraham. We're including all of those people who were part of human history, and that Jesus is for all of those people, not just for the people who can link themselves back to Abraham. Now, we have a really deep understanding of Ishmael and the Islamic people, Abraham, Hagar, Ishmael. Hagar and Ishmael get kicked out, but then Ishmael comes back for Abraham's funeral. So you have some inclusion of different people in that kind of story, but all the rest of the world, all the way up through Genesis 12, are represented in Luke, as Luke connects Jesus with God, Adam, and then moves forward through. Matthew seems like he's excluding everybody that came before Abraham. So you have these different kind of exclusion points happening. You have Luke bringing in everyone before Abraham, but then his Beatitudes are very, very strict. Almost really hard to even see how you could be a part of that. You've seen this before, the comparison between Luke and Matthew. Luke brings everybody in with the genealogy going all the way back to God, but then when Luke has his Beatitudes, you got four groups of people who are being blessed. You may not find yourself in that story. There are a lot of people who will not find themselves in that story. Me personally, I didn't grow up rich, but I've never been poor. I've never had to go to bed hungry, except if I was got in trouble. But I never went to bed hungry. Certainly there are times when I've wept, but it's not just a life of weeping, of deep sadness. I don't really have anybody that I know of that hates me or excludes me or reviles me because I'm a Christian. So I don't know if I find myself in that list. But wow, the bottom four of Luke, the ones that are highlighted in that teal color, I wonder how many of those do I fit in? I don't like that. So I feel maybe a little bit more excluded in the Beatitudes that Luke puts in, but I feel like I'm a part of that human family as Jesus' genealogy is brought to all the way to the creation. Matthew does the exact opposite. Matthew starts at Abraham, excludes everybody before, but Matthew writes his Beatitudes in such a way that I can find myself in almost every one of these Beatitudes at times. There are times when I felt poor in spirit. There are times when I felt like I was not a part of God. God had abandoned me. There are times when I've been mourned. There are times when I feel like I've been weak. There have been times when I hunger and thirst for righteousness. Oh yeah. And then the merciful and all of these other ones. So this whole idea of who's in and who's out, Luke's list is pretty exclusive and specific. You might find yourself either on the blessed or the woe list, but you are going to find yourself in the line of Jesus being included in the salvation plan of God as Jesus's genealogy goes all the way back to the creation. Matthew excludes all of those people in terms of where Jesus' genealogy starts, but his list is way more inclusive. This whole spiritualization, we can find ourselves on Matthew's blessed list in a lot of ways. So both of them are doing, they're writing their gospel, they're writing the good news, and they're trying to include, I think, the world in all of this, and they do it very, very differently with those different examples. Any questions about that at all? I don't want that to be super confusing, but we sometimes the Beatitudes can be used to, like, make people, it's us against them, and I just wanted to be able to say, well, there's something bigger going on than that simple story of that. All right, so we'll go real quick through the first couple. Poor in spirit again. The Spirit of God. There are people who believe that they do not have God for whatever reason. Maybe they believe they don't want to have God. Maybe they don't feel like they have God. They feel like maybe God has abandoned them. But they have God. They are the ones that have God. To be mourned is not necessarily that personal term, especially in the Gospel of Matthew. This collective disadvantage that was going on in the people's time as they were being persecuted by the Romans and the Jewish kind of conspirators that were part of that as well, and that the promise for them is there. Again, we talked about meek. A lot of times we use meek to kind of oppress other people, and you should be meek. But the person who was called meek, the first that we know of, especially in this meek humbleness, was Moses, and Moses was not a pushover, and neither was Jesus. Meek doesn't mean weak at all. It means to know who you are and to act out of your own identity. And especially when Jesus, they used the riding of the donkey. A lot of people use the riding of the donkey into Jerusalem as Jesus is being humble and meek. No, to ride a donkey into Jerusalem meant that you were the king of the Jews. That's what King David rode. That's what all the kings rode. They rode donkeys. They didn't ride horses back in those days. So being meek is fierce sense of knowing who you are and knowing what your mission is, and being that calm and confident, strong leader as well. And then we're going to get into the one for this week, Matthew 5, verse 6. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. And I'm going to give you two main kind of thoughts about this, what this righteousness is all about. There are some commentators that talk about righteousness as God's work. This is what God will do. God will bring justice, salvation. We hunger and thirst for righteousness. This is kind of the term that we use. God's going to get them. In the end, God will get them. God will judge. And typically what we mean by that is that God's going to end up doing what we want God to do. Especially if someone's hurt us, especially if someone has done some evil things and maybe seem to get away with it. This beatitude is like, nope, God's going to get them in the end. And again, I don't know if God's really going to ask us our opinion, what God's going to do with anybody. But that's kind of that thought. That's kind of that kind of interpretation of that word righteousness. But if we look at, especially the context of what Matthew's trying to do, if this was in Luke, it'd be seem like a little bit more easier to kind of put in that kind of category that God's gonna get them, and kind of put in that context. But in the context of Matthew, this might be more of an action of the disciples, that hungering and thirsting actually leads us to seeking after rightness and to do rightness. This is not just hungering and thirsting and never being able to reach for that bread or that water. It's a way of living. It's a way of being in the world. Hungering and thirsting for righteousness means that you're open, you're seeking, you're ready to live that way. And just in the very kind of next part of this Sermon on the Mount, Jesus kind of defines what this hungering and thirsting looks like. Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, the kingdom of heaven isn't this faraway place when we die. The kingdom of heaven is coming near, right? I mean, that's what Matthew says over and over and over again. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom of heaven is near. Let us live into that. It's not something that happens to us later. It's something that's happening to us each and every day. And he pulls in the Pharisees in the fact later on in Matthew 20, 21, 22, somewhere around there, you're going to have Jesus really rip on the Pharisees. And that's when he brings in the woe to you, Pharisees. And one of the famous lines is, I just said it this week in the sermon. He tells them these Pharisees put burdens on the shoulders of the people and give them no relief at all. The Pharisees are proud when they pray, right? They want everybody to see their religious acts. He tells the Pharisees, you clean it, you spend all this time cleaning the outside of the cup, but the inside is dirty. And it reminds me of I don't know if you've ever been in office kind of spaces and office realities where there's a coffee machine and people are drinking coffee, and there's someone's mug is just, they keep using it, and it's the nastiest, grossest thing you've ever seen. It's like, how do they keep drinking out of the same cup? Somebody needs to wash that. And that verse always kind of reminds me of that the Pharisees are dirty on the inside, because what they're not doing is they're not hungering and thirsting for righteousness. They are hungering and thirsting for their own well-being. They're hungering and thirsting for their own pockets, for their own advancement, instead of the work of the people. If they were hungering and thirsting for righteousness, they would be in the face of every Roman. They would be in the face of every Herodian, and they would be with the people to help bolster them and to give them what they need. But instead, the Pharisees have laid over on top of the oppression of the Romans, the oppression of the Herodians, and the Sadducees. They've laid on top of them this other layer of really, really strict law, and they're not even following themselves. So this whole righteousness thing is about seeking after rightness, to do rightness, to hunger and thirst after something motivates you to that kind of end. But this is still God's work. God is still the actor in this, even though we're being called to do that. There is this promise of being filled, and the word that they use for filled, being filled up, is like taking an animal and fattening it up as quickly as you can, or being stuffed. It's like what a lot of people feel like on Thanksgiving Day. I remember, I think this was probably 7-8 years ago. I was at my in-laws for Thanksgiving, and Grandma Gladys was making, she had Swedish meatballs, we had ham, we had I don't even remember. We had like 4 different kinds of meats and 3 different potatoes and 2 different beans or whatever. And our plates were just full. And then she hands me this apple pie that's like half the or a quarter of the apple pie. And I felt like I had to eat it because, you know, it's Grandma Gladys. And I had to go down into a deep, darkest place of the house and sit there for about 30 minutes because I was about to explode. That's how stuffed God is promising to fill the people who are hungering and thirsting for righteousness. They will be so filled with righteousness that the world will be so filled with righteousness, being so filled with seeking after rightness and doing the right thing, that they will feel like stuffed, like they just had Thanksgiving dinner. Of course, Jesus didn't know about Thanksgiving, but and they couldn't eat ham, so that's a problem. Oh, that's crazy. Anyway, so that's the fourth beatitude, and then the next beatitude is somewhat similar, which is maybe why it's next to each other. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. When we read the word mercy, we also read it as part of it as forgiveness, because right away, right after beatitude, then again in the Sermon on the Mount, and then further on, you're going to have Jesus talk about forgiveness over and over and over again. For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. That's in the Lord's Prayer. That's in the teaching of the Lord's Prayer. I believe it's 7 or 9 times in the Lord's Prayer and the teaching that Jesus uses the word forgive. It's the word that's used more than any other word. It's so important to forgive. And Jesus knows why, because it will tear at community. And what Jesus is trying to do is Jesus is trying to build community. He's trying to build a group of people that will follow, that will be able to live in a certain way with each other. And the Apostle Paul knows this as well. And he talks about that a lot in his letters. When you're trying to build a church, when you're trying to build something that it takes human beings to do it, odds are there's going to be some feelings that get hurt, and some people are going to make mistakes. Some people are going to say some stupid stuff or do some stupid stuff. And the only way back is to forgive. Matthew 7, right after this beatitude, do not judge so that you may not be judged. For the judgment you make, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, let me take the speck out of your eye while the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, which is a word that Jesus reserves for the Pharisees a lot. You hypocrite, take out the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. And then this is not the full golden rule. That's going to come later on. Actually, that's coming up this week for our sermon. Sarah Storbeck's preaching this week. And I always give the staff the sermon series. You know, I do it 6-8 months ahead of time. So we're now already in planning for after Advent, after Christmas and the New Year. And I always send it to them via email, and I say, hey, if anybody wants to take one of these, go ahead. And no one really ever does. Except for Sarah. Sarah will take one. And so Sarah took this one, and it's the golden rule in Matthew 20. But this was the very beginning of the golden rule, Matthew 7. It's the early part of it. He doesn't really flesh it out in this early part of Matthew, does it later. In everything, do to others as you would have them do to you. So it's not just mercy as forgiveness. It's mercy more than forgiveness. It's not just about forgiveness for specific actions. It's about a generous attitude that sees the world through the eye of the other. This is really hard. We're seeing this happen in our politics. It is really hard. There are people that talk to me and they say, I cannot believe that such and such is going to vote for such and such. And it's on both sides. They're mad and they're angry, and it's killing relationship. It's killing community. Um, we're not able to see the world through the eye of the other, and it's destroying us. It's destroying families. It's destroying friendships. Um, in the end of it, certainly every one of us would want to see our values and our hopes being represented in the highest elected office of the land. But what's going to happen is that's not going to be the definer for our lives. What it will be are our relationships with our kids, with our spouses, with our friends, with our family. Those are the things that matter in the longer haul. And we can certainly do everything we can in the meantime to try to make the world a better place. But we're allowing ourselves to be used by these machines that are out there to destroy the things that actually really matter to our day to day, which is our family, which is our loved ones, which is our friends. And it's really, really hard. And being able to see the world through the eye of the other doesn't mean you have to agree with it. Doesn't mean you have to sanction it, but it gives you a sense of mercy for the other. We become slow to anger instead of fast to anger. I mean, we're quick to anger in our world. Refuse to gloat when someone makes a mistake. I haven't watched a lot of football, like American football, because I've been watching a lot of soccer, even on TV, which I know a lot of people think is super boring. I used to think it was really boring too. So I haven't watched a lot of American football, and for this past couple weeks I've been starting to watch a little bit of my Longhorns, and I watched some pro games, and the gloating that's going on the field is like, what? Anyway, it's really weird, but that happens all in our society. The gloating that's going on all over in social media and all of that. Being merciful is not gloating over someone else's mistake. It's showing them mercy. And then it's not just about revenge. We don't have to live in this world where revenge is the direct response to somebody that hurts us or somebody that hurts someone that we love. And what Jesus is going to say later on in Matthew, he takes the Old Testament teaching, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and he says, turn the other cheek. That's mercy. If someone wants you to carry their stuff for a mile, carry it for two. If someone asks for your coat, give them your tunic as well. That's mercy. That's not revenge. That's being able to give ourselves over to something greater. And again, I said, it's really, really hard to do that. Now, this beatitude, we see a more clear link to Luke's list. It's very straight up because it doesn't necessarily overly spiritualize what merciful means. And Jesus spends a lot of time in Matthew unpacking mercy and forgiveness. The merciful will be dealt with mercifully. That's an implied woe. It doesn't say woe to you who aren't merciful in this beatitude, but it's kind of an implied one. That, man, you know what, if you don't give mercy, you may not receive it, which, we want our Jesus to be a little nicer than that. But that's where he leaves us with that mercy. So I'm trying to practice that in my own life. Actually, I'm trying to practice being more merciful, turning things off, not getting so caught up, especially in the election this year. Trying not to judge people who are gonna look at the world differently than I do, and try to figure out ways to be in relationship with people. It's hard because we've sorted ourselves. I don't know if you've read The Big Sort or heard about that. but Americans have been sorting themselves out and in groups based on kind of what they believe and what they stand for. The one big area that you don't really sort yourself out of is your family, and people have started to sort themselves out of their family even as well. But that's one of the big things I'm working on, just on my own journey. Not in order for me to. I'm not trying to do it so I can receive some future gift down the road from God. But I believe that the gift that comes in that is a greater understanding of who I am and who other people are, even in the midst of things that I don't want to start shouting past people and try to show them some mercy. Very hard to do, but I think, of course, it's something worth my time and my effort. So that is you're all